Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Nishitani begins his book, The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, which is actually a set of lectures that he gave by noting, I've been asked to speak about nihilism, which has become something of a trend in the post-war era, and he mentions the existential philosophies of Sartre, Heidegger, and others, as he's going to talk about in this work, which are major elements in contemporary intellectual history. And he says they also have connections with nihilism, and that's probably why people are so interested in the topic. But we have to be kind of careful if we really want to understand what's going on with nihilism and how existentialism is in part a response to it and part of the self-overcoming of nihilism referred to in the title. We have to approach nihilism in a way that does justice to it, you could say. And this is a typical, philosophical concern early on in studying a subject matter. So he warns us that he says, insofar as the approach to nihilism is not itself nihilistic, I sense it may obstruct our understanding of the matter at hand. And now notice how he is couching this. I sense, he's not saying I know for a fact, and he uses, modal words like could, may. So it's expressing a not mere possibility, but a likelihood. It's not closing things off entirely, but Nishitani is going to be making the case that we need to adopt an attitude, an approach, which is itself going to feel nihilism as a central problem, not just something off there in the distance. So he says that this fact itself is in some sense a symptom of nihilism, and particularly, one of the topics he's going to discuss in this, nihilism in Japan. So he says, I will begin by focusing on these 2 points, one of which we're going to look at here, the non-nihilistic nature of our way of inquiry, and then, nihilism in Japan, which we'll talk about elsewhere. Now, what is the issue here? Jumping ahead a little bit in this first section of the first chapter, he's going to tell us that nihilism is essentially a problem of the self. And he says it becomes a problem only when the self becomes a problem, when the ground of the existence, called the self, becomes a problem for itself. Now that's a little bit tangled there, you might say. Well, wait a second. How can the self become a problem for the self? If you've already got a self, you don't really have a problem of the self now, do you? And as we're going to see, well, it is quite possible, and it does occur to many selves, not only right now or in the time that Nishitani is writing, but in the centuries before that as well. And he's going to outline for us successively a number of approaches that there's nothing wrong with them in themselves, and as he remarks, they work for some other topics. But if we want to understand nihilism, then these are going to be unproductive. They're going to block the road to our inquiry. They're going to lead us astray. So the first thing that he cautions us about is what he calls a detached spirit of inquiry. totally appropriate for other intellectual problems. And then he says, now notice, not just nihilism. In the case of existentialism and nihilism, it is inappropriate. And what is this consistent? So he talks about the attitude of wanting to know about nihilism. So looking at it, you could say, from a distance, or the desire to know in order to not be left behind in conversation. Everybody's talking about nihilism these days. What is it? I'd better figure out what it is so that when I go to a party, when I'm chatting with people and they bring up nihilism, I can say, aha, I have some insights about that. I can contribute to the conversation. And now he's going to say something about this that then shortly afterwards he's going to shift a little bit. It's not that there's anything wrong with looking at things from the standpoint of society. As a matter of fact, we have to do that when we move on to like the philosophy of history. But he says, from the start, one is questioning from the standpoint of society and not from the self itself. There's the problem. The key thing is not that we have to leave society out altogether and just focus on the self. At the start, where should we begin? Should we think about, oh, we live in a nihilistic age and the new generation, a bunch of nihilists. Let's look at their bad music and T-shirts and memes. No, that's not the way we need to go. We need to actually think about it ourselves as selves. So he goes on and he says, if nihilism is anything, it's a problem of the self. And he says, when the problem of nihilism is posed apart from the self, or as a problem of society in general, it loses the special genuineness that distinguishes it from other problems. It starts to bleed over into other problems and get mistaken for them, like the problem of rebelliousness or a lack of values or whatever we're going to call it. It's no longer nihilism then. So he says, thinking about the issue by surveying it as an objective observer cannot touch the heart of the matter. So that's one problem. And then he says, all right, to go a step further, even when it is made an important issue intellectually and the self is the locus of the issue, there is still a danger. What is the danger? That we transform nihilism into what he calls an objective issue within the self. So this becomes something that would apply to any self whatsoever, not this self, except insofar as this self is a particular instance of this universal or generic thing that we call, let's put a capital S, the self, right? So it can't be treated just as an objective issue within the self in an abstract, generic way. Instead, we need to look at how the self is going to be divided against itself and what follows from that. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. Skipping ahead, or skipping down in this, he tells us that nihilism refuses treatment as merely an external problem for one's own self, or even contemplation as a problem internal to each individual self. He says that each individual self has to carry out an experiment within the self. Nihilism has to become a problem not for the self coming from the outside, from society, or from the self as a particular instance of a generic conception of self. It has to be grasped as a problem for my own self, for your own self, for Nishitani's own self, for whoever is going to encounter it. There is a particularization, and this is why existentialism is able to grapple with this so successfully. So now we come back to his remark about the self, and he tells us that nihilism and existence break down the standpoint of the observing self, in which the self that sees and the self that is seen are separated. So we could think of the self as, whether it's mine or yours or anybody else's. You've got the part of you that sees, as he's going to say a little bit later, that questions, And then we have the part of ourself, and it's, sort of, this is the subjective, this is the objective side that is seen, that is questioned, that is in some way subjected to the greater self, right? And in a lot of earlier philosophy, we'd see the whole idea of sort of like the transcendental or the universal. That's on this side. And then we've got all of our particularity, our body and our history, our, as Jean-Paul Sartre would call it, facticity. The self, if it is a self, isn't two different selves, one of which is observing and one of which is observed. There has to be a kind of unity. But you can't just assert this, because we do, in fact, experience this bifurcation. We say, what the hell was I thinking when I did this thing, when I wrote this thing? Who the hell is that has these emotions, that has these desires? We're talking about ourselves there. So he goes on, and he says, when the existence of the self becomes a question mark, an unknown X, when nihility is experienced behind the existence of the self or at its ground, one can no longer afford to have two separate selves, the questioning self and the self that is questioned. Now, notice the interesting ways in which he frames this. There is a compelling, not a compulsion, but a compelling. The self is compelled to become one, and the self resolves not to conceal or evade this. And in this resolve of the self becomes one. So something is compelling, something is resolving. What is doing that? The self becoming itself, making itself itself. But never completely. Never in a perfect unity. Never totally resolving the question. I mean, there's lots of ways in which people try to do this. Think to, classic examples from existentialism. I'm just going to be a waiter. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. And I'll be the best waiter I can possibly be. I'll lose myself in this social role. Well, you can try that. But there's still part of yourself that knows that you're in bad faith, faking it while you're engaging in that. And that's part of yourself as well. So he goes on and he says, only here does the actual existence of the self become the question of the self. So our way of existing is to be questioning, to have problems. He says, to put it in another way, I stand on the standpoint of actual existence, which makes my own self an X. Now, this leads to some thinking about how should we make sense of this. What is the approach that we should take? Should we just adopt, psychology and a scientific attitude towards it? You can do that. That's only going to get you so far. Here we can take some cues from the existentialists who Nishitani is going to discuss in this work. He brings up Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. He says you can follow them in calling it a matter of thinking with passion. Leidenschaftlich. And that also, that invocation of that German term, passion, yes. And it gets back to the original Greek of pathos, right? Which we often translate as emotions. Oh, passions are things that we feel or we're driven by. It's things we suffer. It is suffering. And then he talks about Heidegger, when he tries to understand being through moods or pathos, Stimmung massig, right? And he says, here, subjectivity in the true sense appears for the first time. The standpoint arises in which one strives resolutely to be oneself and to seek the ground of one's actual existence. But what does that ground turn out to be? This is where the problem of nihilism emerges. We don't actually have some sort of foundation, some sort of ground, some sort of universal essence that we can rely on. It is a nihility. It is a nothingness that is at the ground of our very existence and our very selves. The fact that most people don't notice this or try to hide from it or, take refuge in all sorts of ready-made solutions to this doesn't erase the fact that that's there if we're actually looking, if we're adopting a nihilistic approach to nihilism. So, he goes on and says, by being thrown into nihility, the self is revealed to itself. Only in such encounters does nihilism, like death, become a real question. Now notice, death, nihilism can become questions, but in a way that aren't real questions, that aren't questions for the actual individual concrete self that is seeking them out. This is why he says, towards the end of this portion, nihilism demands each individual carry out an experiment within the self. And that experiment is something philosophical, but not just philosophical in the sort of old-fashioned abstract sense. Existentialist philosophy is the way to go with this, and that is, with a few additions. He's going to talk about Mahayana Buddhism. He's also going to talk about a few philosophical figures who are not existentialists, but figure in here somehow. That is the approach that Nishitani is sketching out for us. So, the very important, you could say, methodological and existential considerations at the very beginning of this work.